In 1993, Steven Spielberg's Jurassic Park became one of the biggest grossing movies ever made, and ushered in a new era of monster movies, ones with relatively big budgets, huge ensemble casts, with an emphasis on CGI and visual effects. In 1997, director Louis Iosa made a killer snake movie called Anaconda, which boasted a cast that included Jennifer Lopez, Ice Cube, Owen Wilson, and Jon Voight. Being a student of Roger Corman, director Iosa kept the film short and action-packed. It was a huge hit, grossing over $130 million at the box office and spawning a series of sequels. A year later, in 1998, Stephen Sommers, who would go on to have a huge career with The Mummy, released his own creature feature set on a cruise ship called Deep Rising. Unlike Anaconda, Deep Rising was a massive flop, but over time has become appreciated alongside Anaconda as one of the great creature feature B-movies of the 1990s. Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of nature in horror, and we discuss two more 90s creature features, Anaconda and Deep Rising. Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike Muncer, and as ever, I am your host. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre, one subgenre at a time. We are currently in the middle of our 10th season, exploring the evolution of nature biting back in horror, and this is part 23. In this week's episode, as that intro suggested, we are going to be covering two more 90s creature features. So much fun, these films. Anaconda from 1997 and Deep Rising from 1998. Give them both a go if you haven't seen them before. Give yourself a little treat, because we will be talking about these movies in spoilerific detail. So, joining me to discuss these two bangers, I've got two returning guests. They were here last series to discuss The Strangers with me, and they are also co-hosts of the fantastic Horror Queers podcast, the brilliant Trace Thurman and Joe Lipsett. Hello, guys.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello, guys. Thank you so much for being here. Joe, how have you guys been? Has it been a busy October for you both?
It's always wild. Although, ironically enough, as we've discovered, if you're creating things, you're often busier at the end of September and early October because people are trying to schedule things to fall around Halloween period. So it feels like it's been...
Sure.
I mean, I'd love to say it's been a sprint, but it feels like it's been a marathon at this point.
Yeah, I know the feeling. It felt like it was never going to end. November is quite welcome at this point. Guys, let me ask you, you came here during our home invasion season. Now, obviously, we're doing this kind of nature bites back series, eco-horror, creature features, animal attacks, that kind of thing. What are your thoughts generally? Are you fans of these kind of creature features movies?
Oh my God, I love a good creature feature. Like Trace and I think are in agreement that we both love slashers first and foremost because we kind of came of age in horror circles when they were having a second renaissance. But God, a creature feature, an animal attacks movie, it is near and dear to my heart. It's like my second favorite subgenre. So it doesn't matter what the animal is, where we're set, but we do love an aquatic horror. So this is a very good fit for us.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, aquatic horror, like, I mean, it's a subgenre within a subgenre, right? Mm-hmm. Which is not something you can say for, like, what other genre besides horror has something like that? But yeah, I just love creature features, or if you want to be like elevated about it, natural horror.
Boo! Get out of here!
I know, I hate it so much. No, there's just something great about it, and I love that we got this wave of them in the 90s because the two movies we're discussing today. Funnily enough, one of them was one that I watched all the time as a kid, and one of them was one that I didn't see until much later in life.
Yeah, am I right in thinking when you guys came on here before and you were telling me a little bit about, did you guys kind of initially bond over your love for these kinds of movies, these kind of 90s, like, sort of aquatic horror movies and that kind of thing, right?
Yeah. I mean, Joe, was there a specific one, or was it just more like, oh, we both like creature features? I think that was the bulk of it, right?
I think it was that. So we started doing editorials for Bloody Disgusting, and when we were looking at different titles, at a certain point we said, well, we could do these a little bit more frequently if we don't always focus just on queer horror. And then we thought, well, what are some of the other titles that we would just love an opportunity to write or talk about. And I think we both identified Anaconda as something where we're just like, there's nothing really super queer about it, but we would just love the opportunity to talk about how much we just unabashedly adore that film.
Yeah. Well, also like how a studio gave a movie about a giant snake a $45 million budget in 1997. Like that is just, and that it made more than that and like was successful.
Unbelievable, right? And I want to come specifically to that kind of 90s era in a minute, but I think what's really interesting as well, when we look at different subgenres, you look at slashers or, I don't know, folk horror, these things kind of seem to kind of come and go in waves, whereas these kind of animal attack movies, or whatever you want to call them, it feels like ever since Jaws, they've kind of been enduringly popular, right? Like, what is it that attracts audiences to these sorts of movies, Joe, do you think? Like, even this year, right, we've had like 2 spider movies, we've had a couple of shark movies, like, people love them no matter what, it feels like, right?
Yeah, I was thinking about this question because I think that there is a sort of hypothetical elevated response, which is that, you know, we as human beings like to be reminded occasionally that we may consider ourselves at the top of the food chain, but there's a lot of things that will happily eat us given the opportunity. So it's like, oh, these are the things in the world that we're afraid of. But in reality, I think it's just, you can have a lot of fun with these kinds of things. Like the idea that you can step outside your door and Mother Nature will try to eat you or murder you. There's just an inherently fun and I think money-making premise at the heart of that. Like Jaws proved you can make a shit ton of money by having a shark eat a human being.
Well, but at the same time, though, I think it's interesting because I don't think it's a surefire thing where it's like, oh, you have a creature feature, it's going to make a lot of money, because they normally walk that fine line between, like, you know, seriousness and camp. Or, again, like, camp would be failed seriousness or just horror comedy. Like, I think you see a lot of creature features that are horror comedies now. And it doesn't always work. And I think because I can't peg down how successful a creature feature film will be as it comes out, like I that's what I find so fascinating about it. You know, like, why did The Shallows and 47 Meters Down do so well, but then that sequel to 47 Meters Down did absolutely nothing, like no box office business at all. But I also think the second 47 Meters Down is a quote unquote stupider film than the first 47 Meters Down. Yes. So I think with the films we're talking tonight, I think there might be something telling too about both of their box office performances and the approach they take to the material. That's really interesting. And I think you're right. Like there's this funny kind of weird kind of thing with them where we don't always take these movies that seriously. They are kind of almost like kind of B-movie schlock a lot of the time, right? And yet also these are the things, if you take any kind of monster, these are the things that actually pose the most real danger to us on the planet, right? Especially in this era of climate change, you know, nature poses more of a threat to us than anything else, right? And yet these movies, we don't actually take them seriously as a kind of like mortal threat, I suppose, in the same way, you know? Because I think it's always a thing where it's like, you know, you watch a creature feature and it's like, okay, but how realistic is it really? Like, is a shark really going to come eat you? Like, the odds are probably not.
Yeah. Are you guys very kind of outdoorsy, at one with nature people yourselves? Like, Joe, would you go swimming in the ocean? Like, you know, sharks be damned?
Yes, I would. I'm not as outdoorsy as I would like to be because I live in too large a city and I don't drive. But I used to be a pretty avid hiker and camper when I was growing up. My dad and I would go out and do long weekend hikes where we would be intense walking, you know, like 12 kilometers and rugging it out in the bush. But nowadays, unfortunately, not as much.
Well, I am exactly as outdoorsy as I want to be, which is to say not at all. I don't like camping. I don't like hiking. I absolutely will swim in the ocean. I've been swimming with sharks in, like, you know, 50 feet deep water. Like, I love that kind of shit. But no,
I was going to say, you like the adrenaline stuff. You don't actually like the Mother Nature stuff.
Yeah, that's true. But I mean, yeah. You know what? That's a fair assessment.
Do you have any phobias, Trace? Are you okay with spiders in the house? That kind of thing?
I'm not big on spiders, which is interesting because I'm from Texas, and, like, you know, there are obviously spiders in Texas, but they're not, like, super prevalent. But when I moved to Colorado, like, spiders are a thing up here, especially in the hotter months. Like, I'll just open my shower and, like, there's like 3 spiders, like, in the liner in the bathtub because they just get in.
Oh no!
So I wouldn't say I'm okay with spiders. I don't, like, freak out, but I also, like, I love snakes. But it's an interesting thing where it's like I would love to own a ball python. Like, I really, really, really want to have like a house snake. But if I saw a snake in the wild, I would not go anywhere near it, like in any shape, way, or form.
Oh God, I'm really not good with snakes. Joe, how are you with snakes?
It's funny. So I lived in Australia for a time, and obviously the recurring joke is that everything in Australia will try to kill you if you let it. So I worked at a university campus that was in the woods. So part of my onboarding was, what to do if you discover a snake in the toilet or in your office or something. And the answer, by the way, was to call campus security because you should not be trying to deal with that issue yourself. But all this to say, the thought that I would even have to come face to face with something like a snake was terrifying to me. Like, we had cockroaches in the place that I lived in, and like, they're just insects. And yet the idea that I was sharing a living space with other things that might crawl over me in the night or something like that, I don't care for it.
Yeah, no, thank you. No. Let me ask you specifically about this kind of era in the 90s then of these types of movies. Because again, there's something really interesting about this particular time for this subgenre, right? Last week, we talked about arachnophobia, as we kind of moved into the 90s. Next week, we're doing Deep Blue Sea and Lake Placid, right? Like, there was a real kind of wave of them, like, pardon the pun, at this time, right? And like,
yeah.
What was it about this kind of wave of movies that really kind of appealed to you guys and to audiences? Like, Trace, what makes these movies kind of particularly special, would you say?
I mean, it's interesting. Like, I couldn't see most of these movies when they came out because, well, oddly enough, we were doing a lot of R-rated creature features in the 90s, which, again, like, watching some of these, I'm like, I am shocked that a studio gave us this much money because it's just not a surefire hit. But I grew up on things like Arachnophobia and Anaconda specifically because they were the PG-13. That and like Tremors, which Tremors is less like a creature. I mean, it is a creature feature, but not a realistic creature feature. But yeah. So, I mean, I guess Deep Rising is not really a realistic creature feature either, but still. But no. So I there was just something about it that I just watched so much as a kid, and because I wasn't allowed to watch those R-rated movies, it did really limit the types of horror films that I could watch. And for some reason, like, if it wasn't like a family film like Hocus Pocus, like, it was these PG-13 creature features. And I think it's just something as a kid when you're like, you're still learning about the world. Like, I mean, when you're in elementary school, how many projects on animals do you have to do? Right. So I don't know. I just think there's something scary as a kid about like reading about these animals that you're learning about, and then like, oh, these things could kill me. I think it's an interesting form of gateway horror, at least for the non-R-rated creature features.
That's so true. And you guys mentioned just now the big budgets too, right? That feels like something so almost unheard of in this day and age, right? In 2024, you wouldn't get B-movie creature features with the kind of budgets and stars that these 90s movies had.
Because I think like the metric now is like something like Alexander Aja's Crawl, which I think the alligators in that movie look really good. I think the movie takes itself very seriously, but it's still fun. But also I think that movie had like a $10 million budget. So it's like, but that's also because of advancements in CGI technology, like it doesn't cost, like the CGI now doesn't cost as much as it did 25 years ago.
Well, and I think, and Trace, I'll give you credit for this because I couldn't really put my finger on why were we giving budgets and why were we making so many of these films in this particular era. And you came upon what I think is the correct answer, which is that with the advent of CGI and better technology, we could realistically make better quote unquote versions of these kinds of films, but the technology was still new enough that it was really expensive. And we'll talk about Anaconda and the infamous price tag. But I think people realize, okay, we can still make money off of these like we did with Jaws, and there's maybe an appetite for it. But if we want to do it well, if we want to do it like Jurassic Park did, then we need to throw some extra money so that we can get some better quality CGI.
Well, and so yes, I think it's absolutely that. And I think Jurassic Park is a big factor there because I feel like when you're talking about creature features, people forget that Jurassic Park is a creature feature.
Yeah.
And with Jurassic Park specifically, it's like, oh, no one had ever seen dinosaurs brought to life like that before. Like, it was like, you'd seen like stop motion dinosaurs in like Ray Harryhausen type shit, but not like in this type of like animals attack movie. And I think there's a sense of wonder there. Again, going back to this childlike wonder of like, oh, I want to see what like dinosaurs look like on screen. And I think, again, that carries over to something like Anaconda, where it's like, oh, how often do you see an anaconda unless you go to the zoo? So I can see something that at least looks the closest like to a real anaconda that I'm ever going to see in film,
Yeah. And I wonder as well if there's like a connection. In the 70s, we had a wave of these types of movies, and they almost felt connected to that big wave of kind of disaster movies too. We had like, whether it's like Poseidon Adventure or whatever, there was a kind of crossover.
Earthquake.
And we kind of got, Earthquake. And we kind of got that in the 90s too. We've got Twister, we've got Volcano, we've got, like, again, there was this kind of, there feels like there's that connection there, right? Between these kind of glossy kind of disaster / creature feature movies,
Well, and I think that's the CGI as well, because it's Deep Impact, it's Armageddon, it's Volcano, it's Dante's Peak, it's like all this. So I think it's a thing where it's like, we can more realistically, quote unquote, portray these disasters in a way that's never been done before. Because you look at something like Poseidon Adventure, like Earthquake, they are special effects extravaganzas, but like, again, Poseidon Adventure's a cruise ship that's turned upside down. Earthquake, it's like destroying like actual property, but like with like the actual forces of nature, that couldn't really be done very well. And so the 90s CGI, you can do that.
Yeah.
Right.
Joe, how much do you think our love for these sorts of films is nostalgic? Like, do you think that Gen Z would enjoy a Deep Rising or an Anaconda at this point in time? I
worry that the dreaded C word would get dropped and people would watch these and say, they're just so silly and campy. Like, I can't take them seriously. And I will admit, rewatching these movies, I could definitely see if people were coming to them with fresh eyes that they might, we might be looking at them through nostalgia goggles. But I also think that these movies have a sense of kind of playful fun, which combined with the dollar figure and often that R-ratedness, it does make me feel like, oh, the 90s were kind of a special moment where we may never get that back because no one would ever take a risk like this. But yeah, I mean, does my love for these films intersect with where I was at as a horror fan and me just as like a teenager? Yes, absolutely.
But I think what makes them so successful for me, because watching both of these films this week, I was like, oh, like they're not straightforward horror films. Like, they're really action adventure horror films, and in the case of Deep Rising, an action adventure horror comedy. And I just like that. I don't know. Like, there's such a sense of fun to both of these movies that that's why when it comes to Anaconda, I always hated all the critiques. Like, oh, it's so stupid, and I was like, so like, who cares?
Why is that a negative critique?
But even watching, I can see someone saying, "Oh, Anaconda maybe starts a little slow because it takes half the runtime for like the snake to actually appear." But and longer in the case of Deep Rising with the tentacles. Like, to that I say, so. Like, the road there is fun.
Absolutely, absolutely. Like, I love that about both these movies, is that they kind of take their time and they don't feel drawn out. They don't feel dull, to me at least, in that regard.
If for no other reason, I think because a lot of these characters are actually enjoyable, and maybe part of that is that we're casting either character actors or people who seem to implicitly really understand the movie that they're in, but then that combined with the sense of spectacle and the anticipation, because we know that we're going to get that giant snake. We know those tentacles have to be attached to something bigger. So I don't know. I think that these films are really good at laying out the foundation for the spectacle to come.
Spectacles are good. Yeah, I like that.
So true. Well, let's get into it. We're going to begin with Anaconda from 1997. What a movie.
All right, everybody. Double check your gear. Make sure it's all on board. Pray you didn't forget your bug spray.
On the rivers of the Amazon.
Wow, it's unbelievable.
This river can kill you in 1,000 ways.
In the waters of the Anaconda.
There's a legend Shirishama worshiped giant snakes as gods, protectors.
Snakes?
No matter what you see.
This skin is 3 or 4 years old. Whatever shed it has grown since then.
No matter what you hear.
What was that?
There's something down there.
That's right.
I really mean it.
I really mean it too.
Faster, come on!
No matter what you do.
Oh my God. Danny! He's not breathing.
No!
TriStar Pictures invites you on a journey into the grip of fear.
Trace, set the scene for us. Tell us what Anaconda's all about.
So, we've got a team of documentarians going to look for the fabled Shirishama tribe in the Amazon. There we go. And
Amazon.
So I was like, is it in Brazil? Do we know what country they're in?
Nope.
No? Okay, it's just the Amazon.
It's just the Amazon.
But while they are shooting, they come across a poacher named Paul Cerrone, played by a great or terrible John Voight, depending on how you look at it, who tricks them into poaching a snake for him, basically. Like, and then, anacondas attack and mayhem ensues.
Absolutely. Beautifully simple premise, right? That's what I love about these types of movies. So first of all, tell me a bit about your kind of history with this movie. Like, Trace, do you remember when you first kind of came to this film?
Oh, I absolutely do. Because, so I know I said I really like snakes. I was obsessed with snakes as a child. So like Anaconda would have come out when I was in second grade. So I was like 8 years old. And like literally any time I had a school project on animals, I did it on snakes. And like I had like a National Geographic collection of all types of snakes, and like I loved snakes. And so when I saw the poster for this movie in the theater, I was so excited, but I was like praying that it wasn't going to be rated R, because I knew if it was, I wouldn't be able to see it for another 10 years. So finally it was. My parents didn't let me go see it at first, and I remember because my parents always got People magazine when I was growing up. So I read the People magazine review for the Anaconda, and it was not a good review. And my parents had to sit me down and tell me like, hey, like this is probably going to be a little scary, because there are things in this movie that like maybe a 7 or 8 year old like might think is very afraid. And I was like, I don't care, like whatever. So yeah, I went to go see Anaconda and double featured it with Volcano, the Tommy Lee Jones one. With my dad one day. So yeah.
Oh.
It was April of 1997. So I think Anaconda had been out for 2 weeks by this point already. And was the #1 movie 2 weeks in a row already. And so, yeah, I was living in hog heaven that day.
Oh, and what did little you think of it at the time? Did you love it?
I loved it, but it was so funny. Like, there were just little things I was like, my child brain couldn't understand. So there's a line where where Jennifer Lopez is telling Eric Stoltz, help me get there and I'll help you shoot it. And my child brain was like, what is she going to shoot? Like, what? I thought they were already talking about the snake, because I wasn't processing, they're going to look for a tribe. They're not looking for a snake off the get-go. Yeah. And then, like, when this came on VHS, I mean, I came home from school every day and watched Anaconda. I had the trailers before this movie memorized. I mean, Fifth Element, Masterminds with Patrick Stewart, Starship Troopers, I Know What You Did Last Summer. There was one more. But like, I watched Anaconda a lot as a child.
I love that. What a time. What a time when you had your favorite VHS collection, and then you'd remember every trailer before every movie that you'd watch over and over again. Those were the days. Especially those kind of like Dimension film kind of times, right? The kind of Scream 2 Night Watch kind of times. I remember that very, very vividly.
The Dimension logo popping up is like, I just get like a feeling of warmth every time I see it.
Yeah, for sure. Joe, what about you? What's your kind of history with this movie?
Oh gosh, I feel like I should have gone first, because my story is nowhere near as epic. It's like my sister and I thought it looked exciting, so we went to the theater, we watched it.
And we thought it was good.
I thought that it was highly entertaining, and I'll admit, I was older than Trace, but I wasn't like in my 20s or anything. But I remember thinking, this is a fun movie, and I don't understand why people are being so critical of it. Like, even then, it seemed really weird that people were dressing it down as being less than because it was entertaining. Like, entertaining was a bad word.
I think also, like, I think it's success. I think people were like angry about its success, but except for Roger Ebert. Roger Ebert's that one critic that really championed Anaconda, which is so bizarre.
He's so weird.
He is weird. You can never call what he's gonna like, right? And what he did not like Deep Rising, right? We'll get to that.
He hated it.
Oh, he hated it.
He hated it, didn't he? But obviously, audiences loved this movie, right? Like, it did so well, considering 90% of critics absolutely hated it. But yeah, I think it is like you guys have said, it's just so much fun, right? I remember seeing this, probably it would have been about 99, 2000, so it was a couple of years after it came out, and it was on television. And by that point, I'd seen Deep Blue Sea and all of those other kind of creature features at the time. And I had relatively low expectations for Anaconda because of all those reviews for it. And even here in the UK, I remember nobody saying anything particularly positive about it. And I remember staying up late one night to watch it, and I was like, holy shit, this is really fun. And then I'd recorded it on VHS and watched it again and again with friends, and like, it's infinitely rewatchable, I think, as well, especially if you watch it with other people.
It's because it's that flat 90-minute runtime, like it's in and out. And to go on what Joe said, like, I think the characters are actually pretty well drawn out. I mean, they're a little bit like, they're kind of like archetypes, but they're really fun. The actors are having a blast, and honestly, once you get to like the back half, those snake set pieces are
they're massive and frequent,
like really, really, really good. And I'm just gonna say, I don't think the CGI is that bad in this movie. movie, at least for 1997 standards. It looks worse because we have an animatronic. And so like the animatronic, I think, looks fantastic.
It's so good.
But I would take like 50% animatronic and 50% CGI over 100% worse CGI like we get in the Anaconda's Blood Orchid sequel 7 years later.
Right. When they're not giving it a $45 million budget.
No, I think they cut the budget in half for that, which is why we get all like more cartoonish looking snakes. It's still a really fun movie with a snake orgy climax, but it's not the effect. The snake effects are noticeably worse for a movie that comes out 7 years later.
I think that is true about this movie, right? Like, Joe, I feel like this movie now has the reputation as being like the film with the terrible 90s CGI. And actually, rewatching it this week, I was kind of like, there were like 2 or 3 bad moments, but actually it doesn't affect my enjoyment of the movie at all.
And the reality is that the bad moments, as Trey suggested, are really not that bad, and they're kind of fleeting. Like, we're actually leaning far more into the practical snake. And when you read the behind the scenes about how they made 2 different snakes and they weighed so fucking much, and one of them went haywire, but they still managed to capture a lot of stuff that makes it into the final film. Like, there's some really fun stories about the behind the scenes production, but they went the extra mile to make this snake as convincing as possible, and it so pays off.
Well, and I think also like just the immersion of being in the Amazon, because I mean, like a lot of the climactic pieces they filmed on a soundstage in Los Angeles, but if they're just on the boat going down the river, they're filming on location in the Amazon. So like, I don't know. I think there's a lot of like A+ technical aspects to Anaconda that were overlooked in 1997 because it was just like CGI snake.
Yeah. And how do you guys find the direction then? Louis Llosa, who, weirdly, when you look at his filmography, like he hadn't done a huge amount before the film, and he's barely done anything since, right?
So he hadn't done much, but the thing with him, the reason they wanted Llosa is because he had spent about the past 10 years of his career working under Roger Corman, specifically filming Roger Corman films in the Amazon. So they actually didn't even want him for his like necessarily technical prowess, but more so, we're filming in the Amazon. We need someone who is familiar with that. And he was like top of the list.
Yeah. But you're right, Mike. I mean, the weird thing is the aftermath. Like, this man delivers a really like critically underappreciated, but commercially super successful film. And then we don't give him more big plum movies to direct in the same vein. Like, it's kind of wild that Stephen Sommers has the opposite career trajectory to this man.
Yeah, well, I mean, one's a person of color, one is not. But I would say though, like I'm just spitballing here, but because Llosa I know lives in Brazil, I wonder if that was a barrier for him. I wonder if he's doing a lot more work down there. Maybe not necessarily making feature films because his filmography is not that long, but maybe it was one of those things. Again, just spitballing. It could also be Hollywood racism at its finest, but wow, just guessing.
But I think, the Roger Corman connection feels so right, doesn't it? Like, there's something very Roger Corman-y about this movie. Its title, its 90-minute runtime, it's fun, I suppose,
It's a $45 million budgeted Roger Corman film. Like, and I think if you describe it as that, I think like a lot of the movie's flaws become boons.
Well, why didn't you describe it as that off the top then, Trace? Come on.
And what a cast, right? As well, Joe, what do you think of this cast? Jennifer Lopez, Ice Cube, John Voight, Eric Stoltz, Owen Wilson. Like, what do you think of this cast of characters?
I mean, some of these people, in hindsight, don't make sense. Like, this is a weird cast to put together. Some of them definitely work better than others. Like Trey said, I think we're getting a lot of archetypes, but the people who are filling those archetypes understand and know how to play them well. But like, one of the things I really like about this movie, not to like kind of jump to the end of it, but we do have 2 people of color who end up surviving this film.
And they're the leads.
And they're the leads. And that's pretty fucking shocking for the 90s.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, if we're talking about the cast, I mean, again, we can go on like John Voight heavily like in a minute, but I do think like, I think without John Voight's performance in this movie, whether you think it's good or bad, I don't know if this movie would have the legacy it does because people feel so strongly about how quote unquote terrible John Voight is. It's one of those where I feel like people are going to watch it just to see, well, how bad is it? And my hope is that they walk away saying, oh, that's actually not that bad.
I mean, it's a choice, right?
I love him. He's my favorite thing about this movie. Like, whatever he's doing with his face and his voice throughout this entire movie.
Yes.
Yeah, the kind of squinting both eyes and that kind of weird seedy smile.
Well, it's so memeable,
it's like
too.
just a smile turned upside. Like he like. Listeners, you can't see what I'm doing here, but it's literally like an upside down U is the smile, as the upside down smile that he makes.
Yeah. Do you think that's true? Is Jon Voight one of the most important elements to the success or the cult success, I guess, of this movie, do you think?
I think it definitely lends the film that almost element of memeability before we were actually doing memes. Like, this movie feels so eminently gifable, and I do think it's in part like it's nice to have one character who really stands out from the pack in terms of they are just giving a wholly different type of performance from everyone else, because that gives you something to either latch onto or rebel against. Like, in some ways, I almost feel bad for Jennifer Lopez in this film because she is the straight woman. She just has to be the action heroine. And when she gets to do that part, you can see she's having a blast doing her own stunts and that kind of stuff. But like, I don't know how you walk away from this film not having an opinion about what Jon Voight is doing.
And actually, I'm sorry, this is like a tiny little bit of a tangent curve, but it's also because I remember when my parents were, well, my mom would not go see this movie because my mom can't even like look at snakes without freaking out. But my dad, he was like, oh yeah, it's Eric Stoltz is the lead in this movie. So like,
oh god,
no, but like he was the name in the cast. He was the one that my parents would have known. And it's interesting that we Janet Leigh from Psycho him in this movie, and so we knock the biggest name besides Jon Voight out of the cast in the first 30 minutes of this movie, and then his role is taken over by two people of color. It's fantastic.
Yeah, I love that.
But
it was subversive.
It was. What do you guys think of J-Lo in this film then? Because obviously this is relatively early in her career, right? I don't know how familiar would mainstream audiences have been with her in movies at this point.
This movie opens 2 weeks after Selena comes out. And I think that also was a big box office. I think that was a reason why this movie got such a big box office, because I do think a lot of the Latin American communities and Mexican communities came to this film to see Jennifer Lopez after having seen her in Selena.
Yeah, it's a wild thing because we, especially as white people, I'm going to take ownership of this perspective. I think we undervalue how much at least the North American box office is driven by viewers of color. Like, there's a reason that you put J-Lo in a fucking movie. It's because she is going to turn people out from Latino markets. Like, they are very, very active moviegoers. So it makes sense commercially.
But at the time, they wouldn't have known this, because I think even Selena coming out 2 weeks prior, like that was just coincidence, unless maybe like they were like, oh, like she's got this movie coming out and we've heard Selena's is really good, so it's gonna do well. Like, I would love to know which one was scheduled first, you know? I feel like Anaconda would be scheduled first, because I feel like the people
it's the bigger film.
Yeah, exactly. But
I mean, I think it gets to capitalize on it, but I guess I just meant more generally speaking. Like, it's not that they were coming for J-Lo, they were coming for a non-white person in the lead.
Well, like, would they have been like really promoting like either J-Lo or Ice Cube as protagonists in the marketing for this film, or was it more? Because I've definitely seen this trailer.
It's the snake.
It's the snake, right? We're featuring the snake, so you don't really know. And it wasn't like Jennifer Lopez, Jon Voight, Anaconda on the poster, you know. So, but I mean, either way, I'm not complaining about the film's success. It's one of those things where I'm just fascinated that Anaconda made like 100+ million worldwide. Like, it's because I don't think that would ever happen today if you put a killer snake movie in theaters.
It's incredible. And I think that's the difference too between North America and the UK probably as well, because I don't think Selena was a thing at all over here, to be honest. And it probably was Anaconda.
And see, in Texas...
Yeah, exactly. It would have been really different for you guys.
Yeah, I agree. In Texas, it was huge.
Yeah.
Huge in Texas.
I don't remember even really being aware of her until Out of Sight. Like 1998 onwards is when she became like a real household name over here, I think. You know,
well, I think it's quote unquote because that's when people could start taking her seriously.
I will say, though, if y'all have never seen Oliver Stone's U-Turn from, I think it's like 95 with her and Sean Penn, it's real good. And she's real good in it. She's like the femme fatale of the movie.
I mean, it feels like it's taken until about Hustlers in 2019 for her to be taken really seriously as an actress. Right?
No one takes her seriously.
Yeah.
No one takes her seriously as an actress. And I think last year, after the big debacle with her concert, like she canceled her tour, like her movie didn't do very well, and people think she's a narcissist. She has a reputation for being a bitch and difficult to her staff. And I'm not discounting any of that by any means. However, I'm also like, she's a very, very successful businesswoman. And maybe, yes, she tries to do she bites off a bit more than she can chew sometimes. But I mean, there's a reason this woman is as successful as she is. And I love Jennifer Lopez.
I wonder as well if it's, you've got this kind of cast of like, they were relative newcomers, right, compared to Jon Voight. And then you've got Jon Voight that I associate with, again, some of those kind of 70s. There is something of a kind of like reflexive kind of nature to his casting too, right, Joe? In the fact that this was the guy from like Deliverance and stuff like that, right? It feels like there is a kind of connection there,
It's a bit of an old guard, right? Where the antagonist is this old man who is just like forcing people to go along with his plan, even when they actively are just like, we don't trust you, we don't want to be around you anymore. In some ways it does feel a little bit like, oh, okay, Grandpa, you need to go sit down for a bit.
Yeah, so true. And Owen Wilson as well, right? Like, was he a thing at this point?
Not at this point, but it was around this time because I feel like, what would you say his breakout role was, Joe?
It's the one with Jackie Chan.
Shanghai Noon?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. That's it. And that would have been, I feel like 2000. But like he was doing a lot of these like the comedy, comedic relief role in these types of films because he also has The Haunting in 1999. And I think there was something in 98, but
he does Wes Anderson movies too, so he would have been beloved by indie people.
But then
and you were right, Shanghai Noon is 2000.
Yeah, that's what I thought because I definitely saw that 3 times in theaters. We thought the farting in the bathtub was one of the funniest things we'd ever seen in our lives. But because I wasn't familiar with Kari Wurr, but Joe, like you were because you watched Sliders. Is it Sliders?
Yes, okay. It is Sliders. Yeah. So genre TV at its finest, Jerry O'Connell, good stuff. But yeah, I mean, she comes on late in that show's run, so it's 4 seasons, and she doesn't come in until the back half. But I remember, like, she was in a lot of made-for-TV, like, kind of sexy thriller movies, because obviously she's a very attractive woman, and kind of like the discussion we had with J-Lo, people don't take her seriously as an actress. And I think, unfortunately, she never really has a breakout or something that proves she can do something other than genre. But I think she also really loves making genre movies. So this is a good fit for her in terms of where her career does go.
Which is interesting. I haven't seen 8-Legged Freaks since it came out, but she does that too.
That movie is so good.
I remember really liking it. And that's a movie too that I think blends like horror and comedy really well because the scary stuff in the movie I think is very scary. Then what? Oh, Jonathan Hyde in this movie too, playing the exact role he plays in every single American movie around this time. So like, he always plays the crotchety British guy. Like I think this year it's Anaconda and it's Titanic, but then he's also like the dad and the hunter in Jumanji, and then Richie Rich's
he's in The Mummy too, right?
Crotchety guy in The Mummy.
Yeah. I feel like we're gonna mention The Mummy a few times maybe in this conversation, right? But yeah, like
just a few.
Yeah, really, really interesting, fun cast in that regard, right? And Ice Cube as well. I mean, we mentioned, but I think again, going back to it after a long time, there was a little bit of me that was going to be a little bit worried that he was going to be played as this kind of stereotype in this movie, but it's actually not as bad as I was kind of like half expecting it was going to be, and I think Ice Cube himself is really good in this,
Yeah, and I know something with him too, where like he had actually quite a few more fucks in his line of dialogue, but then to get that PG-13 rating, they dubbed over a lot of his lines. So if you watch Ice Cube's mouth like closely for a lot of the film, you'll see that some of his dialogue doesn't match up with what he's saying because he's saying fuck, and they dubbed over it.
Love this. Well, so we're introduced to our cast, and we do spend a lot of time like with these characters in the first act before we get any snake action. But how do you find like generally kind of the pacing of that sort of first act, Joe? And like I guess before we get to all of the snake carnage, just getting to know these documentary makers, I suppose.
I like it. Trace, even when you said, it takes 30 minutes to get to this point, I never feel that. Like, this to me feels like the classic get the group together, introduce them so that we can at least understand a little bit about who they are. But I find them all enjoyable. So I enjoy watching the antics, like Ice Cube wanting to play his music and Jonathan Hyde wanting to golf and that coming into conflict. Like, those are character beats that I appreciate because I know I'm going to get to the good stuff eventually. But unlike a lot of other films, this doesn't feel like lip service where, these one-dimensional people and I just want to see them get massacred. I genuinely enjoy the time I get to spend with them I think in part because I know I just have to wait and the good stuff will come.
I agree with you. And I find it fascinating that, you know, people complain about this movie. Oh, it's like such these one-dimensional characters. And it's like, yeah, but we spend quite a bit of time getting to know them. And I actually think that Yosa doles out like doses of the snake at a pretty good interval. So, you know, we get like the first, like, we have the opening, which is the Jaws approach. We have the scene where it eats the panther, which is like, okay, we have this close-up of this head, so it's something. And then Mateo's death, where we get the first look at the CGI snake. But we never get a big snake set piece until they're go fishing for it. But still, yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. I screened this at the Alamo Drafthouse earlier this month for one of my Terror Tuesday screenings. And I had a couple people come out and they said, yeah, it's really boring up until that halfway mark. And I was just like, I think if you're coming in expecting like snake attack, then yeah, you might find that boring. But this movie actually cares to spend some time with its characters. And I feel like some people aren't looking for that with what they are deeming, you know, this cheesy, campy creature feature. B-movie.
I just find that so perplexing because if you look, and Mike, you're probably more aware of this because you're watching so many of these in quick succession for the series, but like this is the standard format of how you do these films. You start with an attack and then you dial it back and you introduce in some ways it's actually very similar to a slasher film as well, right?
Yeah.
Little brief attacks, but then you get into the mayhem in the back half. But like, I don't know. I don't know what people are expecting, if not this, because you can't just have snake attacks for 90 minutes. That's closer to a documentary.
If anything, I would say it's sometimes more boring to sit through a Friday the 13th movie where you have the half-hour chunk of them playing Monopoly while you're waiting for the kills to happen, right? Like, I found that the first act of this actually breezy, if anything. Like, I was really kind of, I was in it. Exactly. I was with the vibes. I was with the characters. I thought it was really good fun. But then, of course, we do get the horror itself. Like how effective as a kind of scary monster movie, a creature feature, like how do you guys, Trace, how effective do you find the horror in this movie?
I don't find it particularly scary because I find it more of a thrill ride than I find it like to be like a horror movie. But that being said, I think there are some very scary visuals in this movie. Like I think there's something about like when you see Owen Wilson's face in the snake's body, like that is haunting. Oh my God. That fantastic shot from the point of view from inside the snake as it's like swallowing John Voight, really scary. Again, of course, then when the snake spits up John Voight, like there's so many visuals in this movie that I do think are genuinely upsetting, even if I don't find the movie particularly scary. But I also think that the tone the movie goes with isn't necessarily one of scares. Like we have some really good jump scares. Like I think when the snake first attacks Mateo, when you're not expecting it because you're probably like, oh, we haven't had a snake this whole movie. Like where's the snake attacks? And then that happens, you know? So I think it's really good at being like a roller coaster ride, but it's not particularly scary to me.
I would say for me, the most successful piece is the nighttime set piece where we're trying to capture it because not only does it benefit from being late at night and we've got, you know, spotlights that are used to illuminate key parts, but it's a sustained set piece. Like I always forget about how long it is and how many people end up being in danger. It feels like we could lose any one of our cast members. And I think that is just a really well staged, well executed set piece.
Well, and I think there's also this great element of it, you know, that where you genuinely don't know who's going to survive and what will be left of them, right? Like, you know, actors like Ice Cube, the classic kind of horror tropes might suggest that he's not going to survive the movie, right? But of course he does. Some people survive who you don't expect them to, and other people don't. And there is that real feeling of danger. And there's a kind of meanness to this film as well in how they kill off certain characters. I kind of love that about it.
There really is. And I think it's also, I mean, like, I actually love the character of Westridge, played by Jonathan Hyde. Like because it's interesting how like he goes from this like really obnoxious, like uptight Brit to someone who like actually gets a little bit of character development. They soften him around the edges. Like the scene when he teaches Ice Cube to drive the boat, I think is one of the most crucial scenes in the film because it's showing, oh, hey, like our final three, like you like this character, and they do it right before he dies. Like I always hate that he gets a great like set piece in that waterfall, but like you feel genuinely bad when Westridge dies, and that's not something you would have said after the first 30 minutes of the movie.
No, you think he's a prick.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. Do you think snakes as well are like difficult to sort of pull off as kind of horror monsters? Because it feels like, there are, something clearly works cinematically with sharks, right? And there are certain animals I found from watching these movies week on week that are more popular than others in terms of, alligators and that kind of thing. It doesn't feel like maybe other than Anaconda, there have been a huge amount of successful killer snake movies. I guess Snakes on a Plane, but that's kind of tonally a little bit different, right? Like,
But
I don't know
so
why.
silly.
Considering how many people are genuinely terrified of snakes, right? Why haven't we had more really successful like killer snake movies? Do you think?
I think that snakes, the perception of a killer snake movie, people just lean more into it's stupid as opposed to a killer shark movie, which is why we see so many like DTV killer shark movies every year with really bad effects, is because people, no matter what, will always think a killer shark movie is going to be scary. They're not going to think it's stupid or cheesy or campy. They are going to think that with a killer snake movie. They just didn't in 1997, I guess. I don't.
I think weirdly too, it's harder to build an entire narrative around them because, Mike, even when you said something like Snakes on a Plane, you've got to pack that film with like 50 different types of venomous snakes to get a bunch of variety and keep it kind of visually interesting.
Yes.
But like narratively, Snakes on a Plane is not the strongest film we could ever discuss.
Well,
so
it's also bloated. That movie's like an hour 46.
Truly.
And I think you feel that runtime in a way you don't in Anaconda.
Yeah, but for some reason, I think we're more generous with other aquatic-based creatures. Like sharks somehow, I don't know, you can build different kinds of things around them. But I think when people think of snakes, they think, well, what are we going to do? Have characters out in the woods? Or we're just going to have, a rattlesnake in a kitchen or something? How do you make an entire film out of that? And I just don't think that people have really bothered to spend the time or the creative energy to unpack it.
So I will say, there was a TNT, it was either TNT or TBS, like made for that channel movie when I was growing up with Harry Hamlin and Shannon Sturgis called Silent Predators. And this is probably like 1999. Ish, but it's basically like this crate of like super genetically altered rattlesnakes gets dumped into town. It's like one bite and you die, and these rattlesnakes like consume this small town.
Nice.
And they use, because it's a fucking TNT movie, they use real snakes for this, and I don't know if they were like defanged rattlesnakes or what it was, but like, I'll never forget there's a scene where a woman's like on her like exercycle, and then like all these rattlesnakes just like circle her in her living room, and she's like trying to get on top of it as they're like striking her. And I'm sure this movie probably isn't good because it's a TV movie from 1999, but I'll never forget being so fucking scared because it was real snakes in suburbia that I just thought was so fucking scary. So it's something like that where it's like, oh, like they use real snakes for this movie, but then anytime if we ever get a theatrical snake movie, it's not. And I get why. Like snakes aren't really the best at training. Like they're not the easiest animals to train. So like you can have a snake wrangler, but they're still kind of unpredictable. Right. But I don't know. I find it fascinating that a TV movie in '99 like did these real snakes, and like nothing we've gotten since then really does the real, or even the animatronics. But I guess the animatronics are also more expensive.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know. And I wonder if there's something about making them look cinematically interesting or something. Like even in this movie, they have to make the anaconda make this noise, right? That I don't think any snake has ever made before, right?
And the voice of the snake is Frank Welker, the voice of Fred Jones from Scooby-Doo. I love that.
God, amazing.
So good. Like, to me, that means that they recognize that we need to do something just to make this that extra bit memorable. So let's actually have a character affectation for our villain. And I just think, whether you think it's the dumbest fucking thing or if it is a stroke of creative genius, I love that they took the time and the energy to add that into this film.
I love the snake screams. Like,
it's fantastic.
It is completely unrealistic. Like snakes do, again, but
they don't.
I find it interesting that no one. I don't really hear people complain about the snake roar like they do. Let's say the shark roar in Jaws: The Revenge. But like, I think that the roar of the snake gives it a personality. Like both of the snakes in this movie have very distinct personalities that they feel like characters. They don't just feel like a monster.
Well, it doesn't hurt that we also often accompany it with close-ups of the face, and they did work with the animatronics to make sure that those snakes had almost facial characteristics or tics, right? So when you see the snake, it looks like a real fucking character. Like I can imagine the snake saying, who am I going to eat? What's my next move? Like, it feels like it has genuine agency, which is not always something I get from a creature feature, where it just feels like this thing is loose and it's going to eat whatever.
Yeah, it felt the most like the Jaws 2 approach to me. In Jaws 2, they intentionally burned the shark's face early on because they wanted to give it this kind of like striking, like almost like Jason Voorhees mask kind of a look. Whereas I like in this movie, and I know some people don't always notice this, but like the two snakes are very different because the warrior snake is green and yellow and the queen snake is red and black. And there's something so much more menacing about that queen snake. But I also love, again, the way they do the effects, because we're spending so much money on the CGI. What was the stat, Joe? It was like every second a CGI snake was on screen was $100,000 of the budget.
Yeah.
So whenever there's a close-up of the snake, or when it's not needing to move very much, we always switch to the practical snake. We only use the CGI snake if it's like, when the big snake coming down the ceiling, or when it has to move really, really fast, or catch someone off a waterfall. Like, yes, we get those quick shots, but I bet you if you actually like clocked the screen time of the CGI snake in this movie,
minimal.
I bet it's minutes.
Totally.
Absolutely. We don't have the,
and it really feels minimal. Yeah.
But because we just we do have a budget, but also we don't want to use all of our budget on this. So they use it judiciously, which to me is like how we should be using CGI. Whenever you can, you use practical or animatronics, and then you augment it with a little bit of CGI. Well,
because Joe and I found some production notes that were sent out like to press members in 1997. And granted, you see production notes, it's always like really, really, really intense. And, but it's always a thing where I'm reading it and I'm kind of like, wow, they really thought a lot about this silly killer snake movie. But that's the thing. They did. Like, everyone working on this film was passionate about the product they were putting out, which is why it's so funny when I do see people write this off as like B-movie schlock nonsense. And it's like, no, like these people were trying really hard to make the best $45 million snake movie they could.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like this wasn't just a cash grab.
I love that about it as well. I think maybe that's what it is, that there's a charm to this movie that doesn't feel cynical, right? No. It doesn't feel cynical to me. Like, it feels like no matter how silly it gets, these people, all of them, are trying their best, right? Like, they're all trying to make a good movie.
There's a quote from Carrie Werr where she talks about how she really enjoyed, despite all the difficulties of shooting in the Amazon with like the not
the
great
elements.
weather and all this, but she said it really immersed them in the experience so that they could deliver that in their performances. And she said, I actually preferred shooting in the Amazon to shooting on the sound stage because it took away from my performance, or it made it harder. And I'm just like, who the fuck is talking about, oh yeah, I enjoyed being submerged in water and surrounded by actual snakes so that I could give my performance the be all end all for this $45 million snake movie.
It's incredible. And again, like going back to snakes, there is something, we talked about this a lot with arachnophobia and spiders, but there is something so kind of uncanny about snakes, right, as well. And I think particularly anacondas, like I think it does a really good job of kind of the way in which they eat people, the way in which they can open their mouth wider than anything ever should. Like the fact that they do look a bit dead behind the eyes and they move so fast and then they can swallow a human in their stomach. Like all of those things that snakes can actually do. It is the kind of thing that we would write about in monster fiction, isn't it, as well? Yes. And this is the thing I found about these like animal attack movies is that like, oh my God, like who needs fictional monsters when we have some of these real creatures on our planet,
Well, and they intentionally try to make the snake more menacing because one of the changes they made to the snake from like its real counterpart was that they changed the pupils to like the cat eye slits instead of a more spherical pupil to make it look more menacing. And I think it gives it that personality too.
That's really interesting. Yeah. I love it. Well, there you go. Well, Joe, how well do you think this movie kind of holds up, like nearly 30 years on? Like, is this still a movie that you would kind of recommend to new audiences, do you think?
Oh, God, yeah. Sorry, people could not see my face, but the incredulous look as though I would not recommend this movie. No, I know I can speak for you, Trace, when I say, like, this is a 5-star movie. For me, it's so eminently rewatchable. I just, like, I could throw it on if I'm in a bad mood and just enjoy the hell out of it. And, yeah, like, I don't think that this movie has any slow parts. I think that it's actually incredibly well put together, but just a bunch of great set pieces and character actors doing their thing. I think it's a great film.
Yeah, I'm in full agreement. This is a 5-star movie for me, and it's just so I could have it on in the background. I could play this movie in my brain like second per second if I really needed to. Like I could do that.
Actually, we've not said it's also really quotable. There's a lot of really funny, like not just the John Voight. Like none of us have done the line yet, and we absolutely have to talk about baby bird.
Little baby bird.
Little baby bird.
Sounded would be perfect. Little baby bird. No, I think the biggest laugh of the line, the biggest laugh for me, it comes from "Still no Mateo," and then she just like slams the door in his face. or J-Lo's, "I can catch a snake too."
You show him, girl.
Oh my God, I love it. Now, I have never seen any of the sequels. This movie did spawn sequels, of course, right? Like, how familiar with the rest of the Anaconda franchise universe are you guys? Like, are you very familiar? Have you seen everything that came since?
Joel, yeah, I think you've seen the least of them, haven't you?
I've seen none of the sequels, but I've always been the most curious to check out the crossover with Lake Placid. I know it's not going to be good, but I love the idea of those films crossing over.
I think it's just the title, Lake Placid versus Anaconda. It's
right?
Like, so the Anaconda's fighting the lake.
Yeah. Where is it set? How does that work?
I have not seen any of the David Hasselhoff starring sci-fi original sequels. I think there's like 3, 4, and then the Lake Placid versus Anaconda. I know I joked about The Hunt for the Blood Orchid, the only theatrical sequel this movie has gotten. The snakes do look bad in it, but I will say that while it's definitely a lesser movie than this, it's actually quite fun. Because they try to the whole concept of the Blood Orchid movie is that they explain why the snakes are so big, why they're so strong, because they've been drinking from these magical flowers for the past 100 years. So they're like these immortal snakes. And as I said, the climax takes place in a fucking like our final girl falls into a snake orgy in the climax of this movie. Like it's I don't know. I think it's a really fun watch. It doesn't have the charm of this one, and I think a lot of that boils down to like it feels more like a cash grab, and the CGI and like the effects are very much more CGI. But there's some really cool stuff, and like this is really good overhead shot where they're walking through the river, and you can see the snake's body in the water, like like scrolling between them. So I don't know. I think Hunt for the Blood Orchid is definitely worth watching. It's not as good as the first movie, but it's not terrible.
Love this.
So slap it on the poster. Not terrible.
Yeah, not terrible. That's the best we can ask for. I love it. Before we move into the second film in this week's episode, I'm going to take a moment to thank this week's sponsor. That's $20 Patreon subscriber Kyle Gray. Kyle wrote me a little message and he said, "Hi Mike, I'm a massive fan of the show. I've been listening for years now and have discovered many a hidden gem through EOH. Promotion-wise, I have 2 anthology books available to purchase on Amazon Kindle Store. A dark and scuzzy horror collection called Video Nasty, which involves witches, body horror, and creatures from other dimensions. Also, my gritty character drama called Kitchen Sink, which fans of Irvin Welsh will love. Keep up the great work, Mike. Some of the best episodes in the series yet have come in Nature Bites Back, and I cannot wait to hear the rest of the season." Oh, thank you so much, Kyle. That was a lovely message, and the anthology books sound brilliant, particularly Video Nasty. Sounds very much my jam. If that sounds like it's your jam, pick up your copy on the Amazon Kindle Store. That's Video Nasty and Kitchen Sink, both by Kyle Gray. One more time, a huge thank you to $20 Patreon subscriber Kyle Gray for being this week's sponsor. And if you want to become an official Evolution of Horror sponsor, get your own little dedicated segment on an episode just like this one, then you simply need to sign up to our Patreon at a $20 level. Patreon.com/evolution of horror. And before we move into the second half of this week's episode, I'm just going to take a moment to thank our next 30 Kickstarter backers for helping us to create Final Cut, the official Evolution of Horror card game. Final Cut is available for anyone around the world. We ship internationally. If you're a fan of card games, if you're a fan of horror films, pick up your game while stocks last. You can head to evolutionofhorror.com/shop. And I want to thank the following people for supporting our Kickstarter and helping us to make Final Cut happen. So a big thank you to Amy King, Lisa Timmons, Jack Bauer, Ben Ridgden, Jamie Denny, Chloe, Samuel Lustig, Cara Bird, Autumn, Kelvin D. Walker, Cassis Brott, Sean Kelly, Asa Shumskas Tate, Thomas Mueller, Rain Perez, Thomas Turner, Katie, Randy Whitcomb, Ian, Elijah Alvey, Judson Cowan, Zowers, Vicky Janey, Dave Bluestein, Mimsy, Luke James, Vissam Abbas Fahani, James, Benjamin Gade, and Hope Kelly. A huge thank you to all of those people for supporting Final Cut. And one more time, if you want to pick up your copy of the official Evolution of Horror card game while stocks last, it's a perfect little Christmas present for your friends and family, a nice little stocking filler. Go and grab your copy right now at evolutionofhorror.com/shop. Okay, let's return to the second half of this week's episode, in which Trace, Joe, and I discuss another creature feature, this one significantly less commercially successful than Anaconda, but no less fun. Deep Rising from 1998.
Welcome to the greatest pleasure ship ever built. Good times forever! I have something here, sir. I've never seen anything like this. It's a malfunction, sir. That's impossible. Where are they coming from? I don't know, sir, but whatever it is, it's, big.
They answered a distress call.
Where the hell is everybody?
Now,
What the hell was that?
they're dead in the water.
I got a really bad feeling about this.
The ship's infested. Let's get the hell out of here!
What the hell is that?
Girl from Ipanema.
Okay, so Deep Rising is about a trio who works on an odd jobs kind of boat. So they will do whatever kind of job is requested of them if the money is there. And yes, that's me butchering the line, but it's a rogue scandal kind of thing where these people will take money and do odd jobs. So they are hired by mercenaries to attack a cruise ship. But when they arrive on the cruise ship, they're allowed to discover that it is completely empty because it has already been attacked by an underwater sea creature.
Yes. Joe, am I right in thinking this is like a favorite of yours from way back, right?
This is an absolute favorite of mine. My sister and I used to watch this film religiously, probably not as often as Trace watched Anaconda, but like this was one that we watched all the time. We could quote it. Like I didn't even realize any of these people were known for any other film. So when I saw Treat Williams had a career in other things, you know, I knew Famke Janssen from Goldeneye, obviously, but you know, this was one of those, oh, she's still doing things and she's being really fun. But this movie to me is just so joyful. It's probably one of, to me, it's a definitive like action horror comedy. Like it just fits the bill so well.
It really does. Trace, what about you? What are your thoughts on Deep Rising?
I do love this movie. I didn't see it until much later because I did not know this was a creature feature for most of my life because
Same! I thought it was like an action boat movie.
Yes,
Okay.
so I always used to get this movie confused with Daylight, the Sylvester Stallone movie about the flooded tunnel. Well, so hey, hear me out because if you look at the VHS box off art for both of them, so Daylight is a man and a woman in a flooded tunnel with like a big orange like hue to it, and then Deep Rising, it's fucking Treat Williams and Famke Janssen on the jet ski as a big explosion, but it's like this orange and blue lighting behind them. So they looked similar with titles that started with D. And so I just thought they were like both movies I didn't need to see. And so I don't know when honestly, Joe, I may not have seen this for the first time until after we started working together because I don't know when I learned it was a creature feature, but I was definitely in my 20s. And so I just never get to the time of day. So when I finally saw it, I was like, holy shit. Like,
how come no one ever told me?
How come no one told me about this fucking tentacle monster? And it's R-rated too, which I think is part of the reason why it flopped. But yeah, this movie's so fun. But I will say, I showed this to my husband and two other of our gay friends a couple years ago, and none of them had ever seen it. And they all three of them got really bored up until I know what is it with these people? No, it's because I think maybe it's because it's a lot of like the mercenary stuff, and so you're hanging out with a lot of these army guys, and so maybe it wasn't the vibe they were in the mood for. But they had turned on the movie by the time they finally revealed the tentacle monster, where they were like, but even watching it last night, I was like, this is so fun. Like these characters are so fun to be around. So it may have just not been the right vibe for that particular group of people. But I think this movie has more charm than Anaconda. I will say that.
Wow. Yeah, I have almost the exact same history with you, Trace, with this movie as you, because like I think I wrote it off as, I think in my head, you know, movies like sort of Crimson Tide and like Under Siege and stuff like that.
Yes.
Like, I think maybe the title, I do genuinely wonder if the title is part of why it didn't do very well. Like, I wonder if it needed a bit more of an exploitation title almost or something, right? Because I had no idea that this was like some schlocky creature feature. You know?
I'm glad you mentioned Crimson Tide, because I think I also was getting it, because again, those names do sound similar, so I do think I was getting confused with that as well.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Well, it's funny that you say that, Mike, because this film originally was written by Stephen Sommers under the title Tentacles.
Right.
And like, I do think it's just that much more of an obvious, easier sell.
Yeah.
And maybe it gives it away because we don't want to review, like, we don't want to show our hand too early. But I do think that that's a mistake.
Yeah, Deep Rising is just too generic of a title.
Yeah, it's almost like it's some sort of twist halfway. It's like a From Dusk Till Dawn twist midway through the movie that this is a monster movie and not like a hostage situation on a cruise ship movie or something, you know?
Well, I actually think that's... So, I will say, I think that's a mistake the movie makes, and feel free to disagree with me here. I actually think that the entire cruise ship, like, meeting Trillian and the attack, needs to just be the 20-minute long cold open to this movie, and then we can introduce Treat Williams and his crew. I don't think the cross-cutting works as well as it should in the first act. I mean, again, I like it, but I think it would have worked better if we did the cold open with the cruise ship and then came across it later.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think it goes back to a bit like what you were saying, Joe, about maybe this movie is more interested in being this kind of action, like slightly more macho action movie than it is a horror film or a creature feature, right? Like, I think that's so true that we spend so much of that first act with those guys on the boat as opposed to the more over-the-top characters on the cruise ship all getting eaten and chomped down by a big monster, right?
And I think that's why we cross-cut it, though, is because I'm sure Stephen Sommers was like, well, we have to meet our hero who's potentially going to be the lead of a franchise of sequels for this movie.
Right.
We have to meet them in the first, like, couple minutes. We can't introduce him 20 minutes into the movie, you know?
Yeah. Obviously, this movie did not do as well at the box office as well, right? As Anaconda, like, massive flop. Again, like, why do you think that was? I wonder whether, I don't know, is this nuts that it might have even been the success of movies like Titanic, right? That led to, because I wonder whether this coming out in 1998, just a little bit too late after a whole bunch of these other aquatic movies, whether they're horror movies or not. I wonder if people were a bit bored of these sorts of movies by then. I don't know.
I mean, this is January of '98, so this opens quite literally 1 month after Titanic, and so and Titanic would be in theaters until April or May. So
this would be like Titanic is number 1 at the box office still.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, again, it's one of those things where, like, you know, you wouldn't think to put Deep Rising and Titanic and the whole, like, twin movie thing, like Armageddon, Deep Impact, but it's like, no, you had 2 cruise ship movies in theaters at one time, and one of them was making billions of dollars, and the other one made $11 million.
Yeah. I wonder if that has something to do with it.
And then we have to talk about how the film gets in trouble because, of course, it has this notorious bad CGI effects.
Yes.
Yeah. And I remember, because we had done a little bit of digging, and like, I will say, I mean, we're not getting promoted for that or paid for this, but like the Kino Lorber Blu-ray of Deep Rising has some pretty good bonus features on like what happened there, because this movie could have come out, well, I mean, in like 97, a whole year earlier, but it was the effect that took so long, and something was going on with ILM, like the work was split, and some people were working on other things, and so this movie just didn't get the attention it deserved. Truthfully, I don't mind the look of the CGI in this movie until we get to the reveal of the main creature. The tentacles,
no, that's real bad, but the tentacles look fine.
Yeah, I mean, they look like CGI tentacles, and I do think they look worse than the snake's Anaconda, even though this is coming out, you know, a year later. But I mean, they look fine. Like, again, for 1998 CGI, the tentacles look fine.
Yeah. And you said ILM, right? So Industrial Light and Magic, like it was quite a big, legit, again, like, you know, there was money behind this, right? So yeah, it shouldn't necessarily have looked as bad as it did. Yeah.
It had the same budget as Anaconda.
Basically what happened is they developed it as practical and they had shot it. So like there is a version of this film where it's like more practical, and then it didn't quite hit it, or they didn't like the look of it as much, and they ended up like redoing a bunch of stuff with digital effects. And
so this was delayed then. It was pushed back from its original release date.
It was delayed. And then, as you said, they were kind of like split on how they were approaching the actual work. So there were a bunch of things that just ended up throwing it off the schedule, delaying things. People weren't in agreement about how the finished product should come together. And then, it's a kind of perfect storm of not good things that lead to this film being a disaster box office wise.
I mean, because it gets dumped in January. It has the generic title. It's not super clear. It's a tentacle monster movie.
No.
And it was trashed by critics. I mean, critics hated this movie, which is interesting.
Which makes no sense to me.
Well, because Mike, you mentioned The Mummy earlier, and this movie does feel like a dry run for The Mummy, because the blueprint of Deep Rising almost feels like he lifts it directly and carries it over to The Mummy, right down to Kevin J. O'Connor as a similar kind of like annoying sidekick.
Identical character.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But that's the thing is, I do think the R rating was a big factor as to why this movie wasn't. I mean, I don't think it would have been much more successful. So, I'm glad we get the R rating because there is some gore in this movie that is absolutely phenomenal.
Mm-hmm. It's so good.
I think the failure of this. Well, I was gonna say I think the failure of this movie is why we don't get more movies like this. But then, quite literally, in '99, we get the 1-2 punch of the R-rated Deep Blue Sea and Lake Placid. So it's like. But I guess those are real creatures, right? They're not tentacle monsters.
And they sold themselves on their creatures. They weren't trying to hide anything.
Yeah. Oh, maybe that's a bit. You just got to be upfront about it. Like, hey, y'all, there's a creature in this movie.
Yeah, I wonder if that's what it is. And I think you're right about, the CGI. Obviously, after Jurassic Park and everything, CGI had become this kind of phenomenon and this trend. And I think also by about this point in the late 90s, CGI had also started to become a bit more accessible and cheap too, right? Like, I think it was a much more easy way to, if practical effects went wrong or if they weren't affordable, people would be like, oh, we can just put this stuff in digitally. And there was a real wave of that, wasn't there? I think we're through to the other side of that now, where people have realized that looks so much worse than just using practical. But I think at this point in time, there was still this excitement over just like affordable visual effects, I think. Right?
And I think I give movies in the 90s more leeway when it comes to bad CGI because a lot of it I'm kind of like, well, they're still figuring out the technology. Or in the case of Deep Rising, like, yes, this should have looked better. Like, it shouldn't have looked perfect, but it should have looked better than how it looks here. But I always find like it's the mid to late 2000s where I think has the most egregious CGI because that's when you're like, oh no, this is lazy now. We're not still figuring out the kinks. We're cutting corners and being lazy. I don't feel that way. Like, no matter how bad 90s CGI is, at this point, it adds to the movie's charm for me. I can't say that about a lot of 2000 CGI.
No, the thing that really annoys me in the mid 2000s is when you get like even blood becomes CGI, like CGI blood splats on people's faces in Saw sequels and stuff. I'm like, what are you doing? Just like, that is the laziest thing I've ever seen. So,
and it looks so obvious. Like fake blood, like CGI blood looks so CGI.
Yeah, it's never convincing.
Yeah, like liquid, it's never going to look good, right? It's crazy that they thought that was a better way to do those things or an easier way to do those things. But yeah, so I think I agree. Like, I think we can give these kind of 90s movies a bit more leeway. And I think, I wonder if the creature also has something to do with it. This idea that, for one thing, it wasn't necessarily super clear that it was going to be this monster movie creature feature thing. And then the creature we get, unlike snakes or alligators or sharks, it is something a little bit different, right? Like, what do you think, Joe, of just the actual design of this? What is it? Some sort of tentacled Lovecraftian thing? There is a name for it, isn't there? They have a name for it. I can't remember.
It's called the Atoya.
Atoya, that's it. Yeah.
I do think that it suffers because it isn't such a readily identifiable piece. And I do think that they were looking to have a little bit of leeway because in a way, this is a double reveal, right? So, oh, you think this is a mercenary movie? No, it's a creature feature. Oh, you think it's a creature feature? Actually, it's a Lovecraftian monster tentacle movie. And in some ways, I have to give them credit for going outside of the box and saying, well, we can do something a little bit visually different. Like, I personally love the way these tentacles move throughout the corridors, like whether they're levitating or whether moving like snakes and undulating and stuff. Like, these creatures have a fantastic, I think the design is really evocative. I love the pulling back to reveal like multiple sets of teeth and everything. But in terms of marketing or trying to communicate this to audiences, how do you describe this? Like, a tentacle monster. Like, people are going to think of Tremors.
Well, and that's like, you tell me, oh yeah, it's a late 90s like tentacle monster movie set on a cruise ship. I'm like, take $100.
I mean, that's for us, but for general people,
yes.
like I tried to sell my husband on this to watch this with me for this recording, and I was like, how do I sell this? I'm like, Indiana Jones gets roped into a cruise ship heist, and then there's tentacles, and he was like, you had me until tentacles,
and that's the thing, and similar to I don't think the tentacles have as much personality as the snakes in Anaconda, just because they are CGI. But there's that one moment in Deep Rising it was when we first get the tentacle reveal, and it like opens up a steam valve or something, and it reacts to it. That is like, you don't need to do that. You don't have to have that in this movie, but it's such a good moment to be like, okay, these things are like individually sentient, and it's really, really cool.
Yes, I love that. I love the design, the kind of like pulsating, the teeth and the things that open up and everything. And again, we've mentioned James Cameron, we've mentioned Titanic. There were also obviously critics were making comparisons to Aliens too, right? I guess this would have been like a few months after Alien Resurrection, right? And I guess there is you can feel a bit of inspiration there too, right? A team of mercenaries versus these Lovecraftian creatures. There is something of a kind of Aliens about it, I suppose.
An underwater sequence.
The underwater sequence, which actually ends very similarly in both films.
Yeah. But I also think that, and I will speak as a critic myself, I think that is lazy. Like, that is a lazy criticism. If you're saying, oh, it's like Aliens, cool. How many movies have been like Alien or like Aliens? Like, I think that is a comparison if you're trying to help people understand, okay, this is the kind of vibe or the type of characters or general plot that you might expect to see. Like, it's a shorthand. It's an elevator pitch. I don't think you can use that as a detraction. It's like, okay, it's like Aliens. Cool. That means if you like Aliens, you might like this film.
Similarly, Aliens on a cruise ship. Cool. Yeah. Sold. Done.
There we go.
Take it. I'll go.
Absolutely. If somebody had pitched it to me as Titanic, but with xenomorphs, I'm in, basically.
Right.
Give me
Honestly, though, the only thing we're missing is that the ship sinks. Like, we explode the ship. We don't sink the ship. And I get why. Like, we don't have the money for that ship. But, like, still.
I know. And I love that the ship is supposed to be this kind of like high-end luxury cruise liner. And like, I don't know, is it much of a luxury cruise liner, Joe? Like, other than that beautiful opening sequence in the ballroom, the rest of it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot special going on this cruise ship.
How dare you, Mike? The Argonautica is good times forever. We hear it.
But I will say, because this is actually a big pet peeve of mine whenever we do boat movies. And I love the Poseidon Adventure, but I feel similarly about that, where it's like we have these like cruise liners and we spend so much time in the underside with like the long metal corridors. But I will say,
like pipes and exactly.
And it's such a boring visual. But I mean, compare something like Deep Rising to, let's say, Ghost Ship. And I think Ghost Ship is visually such a boring movie to look at. And I get it, it's all like old, like seaweed, blue, grays, rust, whatever. But it's such a dull movie. There's at least sparks of color in Deep Rising. And so even though we don't spend most of the movie in like the more luxurious parts of the cruise ship, we at least get scenes with those parts in the cruise ship. So I appreciate that a lot more. Just by comparing it to Ghost Ship.
But I also think that Summers, as you said, this is a test drive for the Mummy, and we know that he's actually very good at mounting an action set piece. And I think he has enough savviness about how to shoot this so that, like, when we get to the climax and it feels like we're just trying to, like, run down a corridor before the door closes because the water is coming in, then it feels too repetitive to me.
But it's on a jet ski, Joe. It doesn't matter.
But it's on a jet ski. But, like, one of my favorite sequences in this film is where the elevator gets to the bottom and we come out into this hall of horrors with all the digested bodies, and we're slipping on the walls because they are slick with human remains. And I think there's your payoff for everything looking kind of the same, because then you hit this and you immediately notice how fucking different it is.
It's really good, that moment. I love that moment. And I like this idea that it was kind of almost a dry run for The Mummy, which I hadn't really thought about. But I guess, like, tonally, there's something here, isn't there? Like, you guys mentioned this is very much a kind of horror comedy, which The Mummy sort of is too, in a way, right? The kind of family-friendly horror comedy. It's always a really difficult thing to pull off, I find. Like, Trace, how well do you think it balances that tone of kind of true horror with like comedy that works?
And this is so interesting because The Mummy was another one that I watched a lot as a kid, and The Mummy did genuinely terrify me. Like, I think there are some really scary moments in The Mummy, and I don't feel the same way about Deep Rising. But here's the thing. This is not a critique. I just don't think Deep Rising is very disturbing or scary like I find The Mummy. I find The Mummy actually scary in parts. I don't find Deep Rising scary. I feel like Deep Rising intentionally leans more into action comedy than horror comedy. I think a lot of the horror comes from the gore effects that we see from the bodies at the end.
Right.
But like, it's not the same for me. But again, I'm using that as the clarifier because if I saw the Deep Rising as a kid when I was 9 or 10, I might feel differently. Or if I saw The Mummy late in life in my late 20s, I might feel differently. But as it stands, I find The Mummy more like of a balance of horror and comedy. Deep Rising is more of an action thriller comedy.
Right. That's interesting that you say that because I can't entirely disagree. I do think that this film has a lot of comedic beats. Like, that's part of the reason why I love Famke Janssen in this movie, because I think Trillian St. James, which P.S., what a fucking character name. What an amazing name. Like,
she goes from Xenia Onatopp to Trillian St. James. Like, hell yeah.
Just diva moves for days. But like, I think that this character is such a joy to behold, and watching the flirtatious banter with Treat Williams, like, I think the characters are such an integral component of the film. But as I said, I watched this film with my husband. He had never seen it, and he was jumping out of his seat at a bunch of these scares with this creature. So, like, I really do think it's effective if you're not a huge horror person, because the jump scares do work, particularly the stuff where, like, Layla, the girl that is dating Kevin J. O'Connor on the boat, so she gets left behind to patch up the ship. The part where she gets sucked out was super effective for my husband because he knew it was coming, and it was just a matter of when and how.
Yeah, that was one of those moments where I was kind of sad at how little she was on screen.
It's the part of this movie. Yeah. I love that character, and I always want her to stick around longer because I think she's such a cool, fun chick. And then you're like, no, I don't want to lose her. Oh, wait, that's why you kill her.
Well, but I think it's because, I mean, this is a male-dominated cast. Like, and Famke Janssen is our main female character. So I wonder if it's like, oh, we can't have two strong female leads. So we got to kill. Because that's the thing is, like, this other woman, she makes a really strong impression in her 2 or 3 scenes. Like, and like, you want her to, she's likable. And
she's chick with the muscles.
Yeah. Meanwhile, we have like 5 nameless army guys who are just, Joe, what is the term? Red shirts.
Yes, red shirts.
Yes.
This cast, though, like, I recognize that they were not all famous at the time, and some of them have not really done a ton, but it's always a surprise when I'm like, oh, Jaimin Hansu, why are you in this movie?
Cliff Curtis, hello, what are you doing?
yeah, really great. What do you think of Treat Williams as well as our kind of hero? Because am I right in thinking they originally wanted Harrison Ford to do this, right? And he very much seems like no offense to Treat Williams, but he does feel a bit like a kind of,
B-grade.
Sort of B-grade Harrison Ford in a way, right? But yeah, how do you find him as our kind of hero?
Oh, I love him. I think that he understands the role perfectly. And in some ways, I think this is actually more effective than if we had have gotten Harrison Ford, who would have ultimately helped the box office of this film. But it feels like this is a B movie that knows it's a B movie a lot of the time. So having a B movie version of Han Solo or Indiana Jones feels like perfection to me.
I'm in complete agreement. I think Treat Williams is so good here. And I do think, yes, the box office would have helped if we had Harrison Ford, but I find this very interesting because the original person cast for Trillian St. James was Claire Forlani, and she dropped out after 3 days over creative differences, so they had to hire Famke Janssen pretty quickly. But the studio didn't want her, and their reasoning was that she was too recognizable of a name after GoldenEye. And I was like, okay, wait, so you don't want the woman to be recognizable, but you want the man to be recognizable. Like, what an interesting... Because here's the thing, though. I love the chemistry between Williams and Janssen, but I also think there's 2 different versions of this movie where you can have just the Treat Williams show where he's the main protagonist without a female counterpart, or you can have Trillian St. James being your lead in this movie and how she's doing this stuff. Like, and that we do the romance route, which is fine, but I would have gladly watched either version of those.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think I was a little bit. I loved Famke Janssen in this, and I could have done with maybe a little bit more of her. She's set up in such a fun way.
Oh, yes.
I kind of feel like the film sort of like forgets about her a little bit.
It forgets about her.
Yeah, in the final act, which I think is a bit of a shame.
Yeah.
She's so good when she's introduced in the first act of the film, isn't she? You know,
but she never. I mean, I guess he does save her, but she's never like a damsel in distress in this movie for me. Like she always at least can like hold her own. But yeah, I mean, honestly, I think one of my favorite moments is when she's just locked up in the refrigerator and she's just like drinking
the non-break.
She's drinking champagne, eating like the hors d'oeuvres. I was like, you go, girl.
Yeah, incredible. You've got Anthony Hild as Simon Canton, right, as well, who I will always think of, obviously, as Frederick Chilton from The Silence of the Lambs, right? And so, like, you just, again, there's something about everyone in this movie, all these recognizable character actors playing exactly the character that we know them for playing, almost, right, as well, which I kind of love about it. Like, again, it's a bit like what you guys said about the archetypes in Anaconda. It's kind of like we know exactly who we're getting with all these people. And Anthony Hild, again, just like scenery chewing kind of villain role, right? So good.
And he's the one that knows about the Atoya. Like, he just knows what they are.
He's so delicious.
Yeah.
That line he has though, where they're like, oh, well, then they're gonna eat us. No, they drink you. And I was like, that's a really cool line.
Really good. Yeah, I love it. Again, like just like you said with Anaconda, I think the long run time and the kind of slightly kind of longer pace of this movie, it doesn't feel like it drags because we're having so much fun with this cast of characters, aren't we? You know?
Yeah.
Do you think there's any, and maybe this is thinking too much into it, but do you think there is any kind of class, economic, social commentary going on here with this kind of luxury crew liner and this guy that runs it and the way it's treated? Like, do you think, Joe, the movie is getting at anything, or is it not so much interested in that?
I mean, I remember when I saw this, I didn't fully understand the financial motivations that Canton has for wanting to sink this ship. Yeah. And now, as an adult who, you know, like none of us have paychecks that match the rise in inflation, and sometimes we overspend and then have to pay the costs. And I kind of love that his motivation is, yeah, it's successful, but it would never be successful enough. So even though this was my fucking dream, I've got to tank it for the insurance. And you think, that's strangely relatable.
Yeah. I don't think it's necessarily like a narrative through line through the film, but there's definitely jokes. Like there's that bit in when we first get to the Argonautica, and he's like, "Oh, you know, we're all rich," and everyone's like, "Oh, yes, we're rich." Yeah. Like they all laugh at it, and like, okay,
yeah, exactly. Like if this was
a rich movie, at least in the beginning.
Like if this was made now in 2024, I feel like that would be much more prominent, wouldn't it? Like that would be right at the front and center of this movie. I think that element.
It would be much more of an eat the rich movie, absolutely. For sure.
Exactly. Yeah. But I love that. And and also we kind of learn to love some of those characters that are the mercenaries, the criminals, right? Again. And you've got Kevin James O'Connor as well, right? Who I think is, again, like, I think a lot of people didn't love when this movie came out. But again, I think he's great in this. So much fun.
I just don't know how you watch this performance and don't appreciate how good he is. Yeah. Like, he knows exactly how to play this character. I can imagine some people finding the character a little bit grating, but I find him, like, when I think of quintessential sidekick characters, this is one of the performances that comes to mind.
Yeah, I think he's so good in this, and I actually think that's why his role in The Mummy is a sidekick villainous character, because it's a character you love. So I think Summers saw after the reaction of this character in here, he was like, okay, because we don't kill this character, right? Like the film wants us to love this character. I love this character. Clearly, a lot of people did not. So I think when Summers was writing The Mummy, he was like, "Well, I want to give my buddy Kevin J. O'Connor a role, but no one likes him. So let me make him a hissable villain that they will love to hate and just wait to see kill."
Yes.
Well, I think that's one of the other reasons that the character work in this film is satisfying, because we're also sort of falling back on this traditional narrative arc of people who shouldn't have to work together, working together, right? Like, it's the enemies having to work together against a common villain. And I think that that's also really satisfying, even up to the point where Hanover, the Wes Studi character, when he's being eaten and Kevin J. O'Connor gives him the gun and then he betrays it. It's a fantastic comedic beat, but it also is just like, it's that one moment where you think, no, they're still actually adversaries and they don't like each other.
Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned the Wes Studi scene too, because that's also a thing where that actually was the moment of true horror that I felt rewatching this last night, where I was like, Oh, like
It's
just
horrifying.
and the one thing we're missing from this movie that Anaconda gave us is that POV shot from inside the tentacle as it's eating someone. Like that's what this movie could have used. But yeah, I mean, just the thought of like, I mean, you're just getting dissolved and liquefied inside this thing, but you're fully conscious. While like when that one guy, like, they shoot his body out of it, but he's still like alive with his half off.
Billy, yes, which is just like the John Voight reveal.
So
It is very much, but albeit the CGI on that face looks real bad.
Yeah.
But still, it's still really, but it's played more for laughs than John Voight's one is. I think John Voight's one is funny, but like in this kind of like, what the fuck is going on kind of way.
Oh, I read it the opposite. Like John Voight's wink to me is the definition of camp, whereas this I think is horrifying. But I mean, even this look, it's wild because we're a couple of years away from Hollow Man, and like Billy's regurgitated remains to me look very similar to what we're going to get in Hollow Man. But we did not critique that film for bad special effects.
Well, because that was the only thing that was the only nice thing people would say about it was the effects of Hollow Man. Everything else they hated.
Yeah, it's true. And also, actually, like, again, talking about the Mummy, there's something about that Imhotep character when he's regenerating and he's got kind of half a face and you see his veins and innards and stuff as well, right? Again, there's a lot of interesting parallels.
But that works better because we just revisited the Mummy
this year,
earlier this year, yeah. And yes, the CGI of the Mummy I don't think is aged particularly well, but. Like when its face is half off and when it's in those partial stages of animation or decomposition, it doesn't look as bad as this does because the whole thing is a CGI creation that's not on like a real person. Like it still looks like a skeleton.
Yes.
This is a real person. And so it just looks bad by design, not by design, but like inherently it looks bad because of that.
It's another director who kind of went off the grid, interestingly, right, Stephen Sommers? Like, considering The Mummy was such a massive hit and The Mummy Returns, and then he did the Scorpion King and Van Helsing.
Well, he didn't direct Scorpion King, though. That was Chuck Russell.
That's right. He wrote and produced it, but he didn't direct it. But then Van Helsing, G.I. Joe, The Rise of Cobra, and then Odd Thomas, and then just sort of disappeared off the grid, right, as well. It's kind of crazy considering, how big, films like The Mummy were early on in his career.
He was so huge.
Well, because I think the Mummy was his last critical success. Because The Mummy Returns, while it made a bunch of money, certainly was not a critical success. Like that one definitely got worse reviews. Van Helsing was torn apart by critics.
I mean, rightfully so. That screenplay is dreadful.
I have seen more and more people like on Twitter, X.
Oh no, are we reappraising it? No, are we in that era?
I'm not necessarily saying it's a reappraise. Like I haven't seen that many people reappraise it, but I've seen more people watch it and be like, okay, like this is like a really fun, like Stephen Sommers-y time. So I've been curious to revisit it, but I remember being 15, seeing that in theaters and knowing then this is a bad movie. So
it looks like absolute shit, but if you go back and rewatch it, it's easy to actually see an interesting film in the Kate Beckinsale character. Right. But we do her dirty.
And I think that was the thing. Like I've only seen it once, and I remember being so pissed off that she dies at the end of that movie and that we don't resurrect her. Like it was because I think I saw that around the same time that I saw Daredevil, and we kill off Jennifer Garner in that movie and we don't resurrect her. And I fucking hated it so much.
Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting, isn't it? He's this flip-flopping between these massive hits and these like historic flops, right? It's really, really interesting. And again, maybe it's just proving how difficult that balance is that we've talked about of kind of horror with action adventure, with comedy, right? And getting all of those things right for a broad audience is a really tricky thing to pull off, Well,
horror comedies in general are, I think, the most notoriously difficult films to market. I remember, like, because I was doing research on James Gunn's Slither recently, which was 2006. And bear in mind, so when that came out and flopped so hard, like box office analysts were proclaiming the horror comedy dead. Like, oh, this movie flopped so bad. God. And this is 2 years after Shaun of the Dead came out and was a massive success. So but either way, I just think that any studio knows now that if you're doing a horror comedy, it is going to be a crapshoot. And it really comes down to the marketing. I think horror comedy marketing has to be much more clever. Than other marketing. So if you have a bad marketing team for horror comedy, I would not expect it to do well box office wise.
And that is the problem, right? Like, I mean, the fact that both of you looked at Deep Rising and you couldn't tell what kind of film it was, like, not only, okay, is it a creature feature or not, but also you never get the sense that this movie is funny. So you walk into this, it's a surprise creature feature and it's a horror comedy with a lot of action in it. Like it's a really difficult trifecta to market, even though I would argue that if you do actually get people into the theater or if you get butts and seats, like, apart from some of the more polarizing elements like Kevin J. O'Connor's character, this movie is really good at what it sets out to do. It's just that nobody actually gave it the opportunity.
So true.
Yeah,
and I think you're absolutely right about, Deep Blue Sea, Lake Placid. I feel like they nailed exactly, like, in the marketing, what kind of a movie you were in for with those films, right? And got it completely right in comparison to this.
That's actually interesting though, because Deep Blue Sea doesn't really have comedy to it, but Lake Placid is a horror comedy.
But you remember, like, and sorry, Mike, I know now we're stepping on your next episode, but
no.
I remember vividly watching the Lake Placid trailer, and you've got Betty White saying, "Well, I hope that he eats you too," or something.
Right.
So it's like, oh, we know that we're going to at least have a bunch of comedy from this iconic actress.
And I think also, I don't know if they promoted it like this, but that's also a David E. Kelly script. So like, It was like, I think people were like, oh, it's going to be witty and funny. It's none of those things, but like that was what they were going for.
Yeah. And I think even Deep Blue Sea, like it was like, I remember even word of mouth about it at the time and people telling me it's really funny. Like the moment when Samuel L. Jackson makes his big speech and then, spoiler alert, gets chomped and everything almost feels like it's a punchline, right? So even though it's not necessarily marketing itself as an out-and-out comedy, it kind of knew what kind of a film it was, I think, right? And wasn't taking itself super seriously in that regard.
Well, and you can also bank on Rennie Harlan, right? Like, it's the guy from Cliffhanger doing a shark movie. Don't you want to see it?
Absolutely. So they go. So I've got to finish just by asking you guys about the ending of Deep Rising, right? As well. So what did you make of that ending? The desert island, the volcano, the monster. Like, was this just a classic, Marvel-esque? Let's set ourselves up for another movie. Let's set ourselves up for a franchise. Like, is that what they were thinking? Do you think with that ending?
So we know for sure that I don't know if they ever talked about it at the time, but it's come out after the film, that this was a setup for Kong. So we were going to do like a Kong Island kind of deal.
Wow. Interesting. So Kong would have taken place in the same universe as Deep Rising. I love it. Okay.
Yes.
Well, but I don't know if it would have been like, in like this Monsterverse type of mentality, right? Like, I mean,
no.
I guess we would get Peter Jackson's King Kong. What is that? 06? 05, 06? So,
yeah.
Because I'm sure, but we hadn't had like a King Kong film in, oh my God, please tell me decades.
Forever.
I'm going to say decades, like the 70s at least.
I think, yeah.
I think so. 70s. I mean, they weren't thinking of like, oh yeah, Monsterverse. We got to set up this whole cinematic universe. It was more so, oh yeah, like, sure, do a sequel with King Kong.
It's where we could go.
Yeah.
Like, we've got one big creature. What if we had another big creature on this island? But I remember when I saw this, I just thought, oh, okay, so we're going to reveal that this thing can live on land.
Actually, you know what, though? That may have been conscious too, because what comes out months after this movie, but Roland Emmerich's Godzilla.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Because that would have been like May of 1998, so like 4 months after this movie.
Oh man, there were just too many movies in and around this whole time, weren't they? They were stepping on its toes.
So actually, I wonder if that was a thing too, where it's kind of like, oh, if Godzilla does really well, then let's
would we have revisited it?
Yeah, we're more confident in a Kong central movie.
Maybe.
I love it. Well, there you go. Well, obviously, we've already mentioned like this movie bombed critically, commercially, but do you think it feels as though, Joe, like appreciation for this movie has grown? It feels like it's now becoming a bit of a cult favorite, right? It's taken long enough to get there, but it feels like it's happening.
I think it's a small but mighty piece. Like, even the fact that Trey said, I had never really had this film on my radar until a couple of years ago. I think it's still a word of mouth thing. People need to champion it if they like it, which is, I like to think, one of the roles that I've had in helping people to discover this movie. But the sad reality is that a lot of people, their first impression of it is, oh, isn't that the movie with the bad special effects still? And I'm like, we're not talking about the Thing remake here, folks. I mean, you can be a little generous.
I think the closest relative to this too, because I mean, I feel like you always lump, not you, but we always lump like Deep Blue Sea and Lake Placid together. And I think the closest cousin to Deep Rising is probably The Relic.
Right, which is also not well regarded.
Not well regarded, but again, it's one of those I think should be better regarded. And I think that Deep Rising's cult is larger than the Relic's cult, but to me, like, they belong in very similar conversations.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think also, part of why I paired it with Anaconda was for that reason of, I think they're both still regarded as like the bad CGI movies as well from the 90s, right? I think unfairly so, probably. So it's fascinating. So there you go. Any other final thoughts? Would you guys give this 5 stars the way you'd give Anaconda 5 stars, do you think?
I probably would, yeah.
I do, Like, rewatching this was so much fun. And I actually think I ended up enjoying my rewatch of Deep Rising more than Anaconda. You don't have to agree. It's fine.
I know. I'm trying to think. I mean, again, I think they are both 5-star films for me, but it's like a... Yeah, I mean, I guess if you double feature them, which one would you watch first? Which one should you watch first?
That's a good question.
I watched Deep Rising first, and I will say Anaconda felt a little bit slower by comparison.
Yeah. Okay. So I'd say do the shorter one. Well, I would say do the shorter one first, which would be Anaconda. But then I was like, well, would you want to do the shorter one second? Whatever.
I would go shorter one. So I would go Deep Rising, then Anaconda, personally, I think, because Anaconda feels more to me like it just like flew by. It just zipped along, actually. But
interesting.
Yeah.
But I wonder though, because both of these films at least do have like very bombastic endings. So I wonder if following the bombasticness of Deep Rising with the quote unquote slower start of Anaconda, would it have the same effect if you did it in reverse? Like, would it make the beginning of Deep Rising feel slower by comparison, coming off of the high octane thrills of the back half of Anaconda? I don't know. Listeners, let us know.
Listeners, let us know. Exactly. Love that. Well, guys, thank you so much. My final question for you, in this whole kind of subgenre, whatever we want to call them, creature features, nature, horror movies, do you have a favorite? I mean, I know that Jaws is hard to top, right, in this whole category, but do you have any personal favorites, Joe?
So I'm actually not the biggest fan of Jaws. I like it. I admire it, but it's not one that I revisit frequently. So I will be the contrarian, and I will say, Mike, one of the ones that you have recently covered is a personal favorite of mine, just because I think it's unheralded and very underseen. So I would recommend people check out Long Weekend, the exploitation film from 1978.
Oh my God.
Ooh, that's plants, right?
It is not. It's basically Mother Nature in general fights back, but it's like...
It's kind of everything.
Yeah.
Oh, I like that. I've heard about Long Weekend and its remake, but I've never seen either version.
It's interesting. And again, Mike, you have a whole episode on this, so folks, you can go back and re-listen to that. But it's not the film that people think it is. Like, they think it's going to be really loud and exciting, and it's kind of like if you took the couple...
Really dark.
It's really dark. Take the couple from The Strangers and have Mother Nature turn on them, but also don't show most of Mother Nature.
It's bleak. Yeah. It's really bleak, but it's brilliant.
It's super bleak.
Brilliant. Yeah. Excellent choice. Trace, what about you? Do you have a favorite in this subgenre?
It's so hard for me to pick a favorite. I mean, again, like I always revisit, as I said, like Tremors, Arachnophobia. I love, like, for modern ones, I love The Shallows. I love Crawl. I love both 47 Meters Down movies, and which I think are very take different approaches. Like, I think the first 47 Meters Down is very scary and like quite serious, whereas the second one is like a Friday the 13th movie with sharks underwater. My pick for favorite will be a bit of an off-kilter one, but it's more recent, and Joe will be not surprised by this. I love the 2014 horror comedy Zombievers. It is one of the funniest movies I've ever seen. I think it's very self-aware. It is it's stupid in the best way, where it doesn't feel like it's trying too hard to be stupid and just being stupid. Like, it's very smart about its stupidity, and it is so clever, and it's also 75 minutes long. So if you've never seen Zombievers, check it out.
I love Zombievers as well. Like, not just ironically, like genuinely really fun
it's like
watch.
genuinely
like,
good.
It's a genuinely great film. Yeah.
I was trying to figure out what I would pair it with on this podcast, and I thought, I haven't seen Slaughterhouse. Is Slaughterhouse a good kind of like companion movie to Zombievers? Or is it just because I've picked a pun?
No, I've actually never seen Slaughterhouse. For the most part, I've heard that all the reactions I've heard from Slaughterhouse is it's a lot better than you'd expect. But it doesn't hit the highs. Like, it's a lot of like, oh, it's a 3-star film, to Zombievers is 4 or 5-star film.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I'll check it out and see. Amazing. Well, guys, thank you so much. It's always such a pleasure to have you guys here. And I know you're so busy with all of your own stuff. And just remind people where they can find you, where they can find your work and your podcast online.
All right. So we have new episodes of Horror Queers that come out every Wednesday on Bloody FM. That's the Bloody Disgusting Podcast Network. And if you want to get a hold of Trace, he's at Trace D Thurman, and I can be reached at B Stole My Remote, and that's the letter B. And then Horror Queers is everywhere you get podcasts.
Amazing. Guys, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening. And one more time, a huge thank you to my brilliant guests, Joe Lipsett and Trace Thurman. Always such a pleasure to have those guys on the podcast. So let me know what you thought of this week's movies, Anaconda and Deep Rising. Are you a fan of these films as much as we are? I would love to hear your thoughts. Please get in touch. You can email me, evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can also find us on all the socials, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Letterboxd, and Blue Sky, actually, as well. You can probably catch me on Blue Sky more than Twitter these days, to be honest. If you want to support this podcast and get treated to regular bonus content, sign up to our Patreon, patreon.com/evolutionofhorror. Very soon we're going to be kicking off a found footage miniseries, and we have got some incredible and terrifying movies to discuss. I'm very, very excited for that one. So head on over to patreon.com/evolutionofhorror. You can find this podcast in all the usual podcast platforms, and if you get a spare minute, I'd be so grateful if you could drop us a rating and review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or whichever is your podcast app of choice, as that always really helps us get discovered by new listeners. So on to next week then, and next week it's going to be more 90s creature features, 2 bangers that I'm very excited to discuss. Next week, I'm going to be joined by friend of the pod, Joshua Tonks, and we are going to be covering Deep Blue Sea and Lake Placid from 1999. Cannot wait. Join us next week for all of this and more on the Evolution of Horror.